now the need of the hour is for Sri Lankans to feel secure about living in this country. Many people are
Mhm.
leaving the country and going. Young people are leaving the country and going. Many of my own
Yes.
colleagues who have children worry about the future of their children in terms of, well, what will this economy be like? Will we go back into crisis in 2028 when repayment has to be done?
Welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Ramananda Gupta. We're going to be talking about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Sri Lanka later this week. And with me, I have a very, very special guest today. Mr. Santosh Menon is a businessman living in Sri Lanka, but though he has an Indian passport, he says his best interests are with Sri Lanka. He's the president of the Lanka India Business Association, and he wants to find a way to get Sri Lankans the benefit of the demographic dividend accruing in India. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Menon. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sen. I'm really honored and privileged to be able to speak to a person of your eminence. Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, the pleasure is ours. But let's start right from the top. Is there a mood right now about the Prime Minister visiting Sri Lanka? Is there some kind of a mood there now? Are people talking about it, or is it just another visit?
Uh, there is definitely a mood build-up. I think all of the media is focusing on this visit with a lot of interest. This is the first visit by a foreign dignitary to Sri Lanka post the NPP coming to power. So to that extent, there is a huge amount of interest in this visit. Everyone in media is buzzing. I can see news articles. I have been a contributor myself to one of the articles, but there's a lot of content in media before the visit, and I think it is evident that most people know on the street even that the prime minister is going to be here, and
Hmm.
I think there is a sense of anticipation, I would say.
So, I mean, is that mood generally a positive one, or is there a mood of expectation? That are the people expecting something to come out of it?
I would say definitely the mood is positive. um, People are waiting and watching to see what
Uh-huh.
will be the result. Uh, because the NPP government has a strong JVP presence, and JVP is in the historically known to be anti-India. Though having said that, I must say AKD and his team, ever since they've taken charge, have been very pragmatic in their approach, and AKD visited India first before visiting any other country. So to that extent, his pragmatism, uh, you know, uh, the pragmatism has been there. But then the fact that Narendra Modi is coming down just now means people are waiting and watching to see what's next.
Hmm. When you speak of the word pragmatism, I'd like to, tell our viewers that Mr. Menon has written a wonderful piece on Strat News Global, which I recommend that you take a look at to understand the dynamics at play here, particularly in the field of business. It's there on our site, and just look for it. Uh, you know, Looking at the article that you wrote for us, you mentioned a bunch of points there that Sri Lankan should do in order to sort of capitalize on the demographic dividend of India and the growth that India has sort of shown over the last uh, decade or more. But
Yes.
what are the things that India should be doing? Because I'll tell you where I'm coming from. There have been Sri Lankans who've been telling me, businessmen, saying that India is blocking our market access. Now, is that a fair thing to say?
I think there has been constant discussion in many of the chambers about uh, non-tariff barriers in India. People have tried to come into the Indian market, and there have been some Sri Lankan companies which haven't been so successful. Obviously, I think while India is a growing, economy, I think Indians would also be the first to admit that getting into an Indian market and succeeding business wise is not the easiest thing. And for a country like Sri
Hmm.
Lanka with 23 million people, when they try to go into India without maybe doing all the right analysis, it's not easy to get into the Indian market and benefit from the Indian market. But I think there are some specific things, like I think recently somebody from the garment industry was talking about the fact that there's an 8 million piece restriction to getting into the Indian market. They can't, as a combination of all the pieces of garments from Sri Lanka, only 8 million pieces are allowed into India. And he was explaining that each sock, if I take a pair of sock, each sock is counted as one. So I think it's two pairs of
Oh,
socks, or two pairs of socks makes it four socks, and so 8 million pieces is really small for the Indian market. I think those grievances, some of those concerns are there, but I think this is probably the reason why I would also say something like a comprehensive economic package, which I think SEPA, which India has actually been talking about over the years, which now has become ITCA, needs to be finalized for the benefit of both countries, so that some of these tariff barriers as well as the non-tariff barriers can be looked at and addressed in a more meaningful way.
mhm. It's interesting you say that because in one of the some other article that you've written, I think for a Sri Lankan paper, you spoke about how instead of looking at, I mean, you didn't say instead of looking at India, but you said how Sri Lanka could capitalize on Kerala. I guess that's your home state,
Yes.
on the growth
Yes.
story of Kerala,
Uh,
rather than looking at India as such. That's a very interesting thing
yeah.
because the Australians have broken up India into states, and they've tried to understand the business dynamics of each state. And
Yes.
I think that's an interesting way to approach it. But wouldn't those, any kind of a trade thing that you do with, let's say, Kerala, would they be subject to Indian government rules, which because of politics or something, they could
Of
sort of stymie or?
No, no, absolutely. I think the first principle is that you need to get the India Sri Lanka trade agreements done. But the reason I
Mhm.
mentioned the context of Kerala is, a couple of things. So first of all, I'm actually a Mumbai-born guy. So my links with Kerala, I have a surname, and my links with Kerala are fairly tenuous. But I also look at the overall context of India, Sri Lanka, and see that there are these five southern states in India, which has an over 230, 240 million population, which probably cumulatively could be $1 trillion as one economy, the five states, and growing at
Mhm.
10-12%, perhaps higher than the rest of the India growth rates.
Right.
So that's a huge
Absolutely.
opportunity, and given that they are geographically closer to Sri Lanka, means that Sri Lanka has an opportunity. And of course, the point I was making in the article was also the fact that I used to be in India in advertising, working on the consumer care business of Wipro. And the Wipro
Hmm.
consumer care general manager, used to have this philosophy that in India is about 32 states. And if we can succeed, go state by state with our brand, which was at that time Santur, he said we could make a really big brand and we could be very, very profitable. And that has really worked for them. And I think this is a kind of strategy which might work for Sri Lankans also, because generally, when Sri Lankans look at India and we say economic opportunity, they are daunted because they don't know where to start in India. I mean, India is this huge country. I mean, Sri Lanka is a country with a population of 23 million people. When they start looking at a 1.4 billion population with a country of that size with 32 states, they don't even know where to start. So, for me, my thinking behind referring to Kerala was this could be an entry point into India. Don't look at India and get daunted by the size of 1.4 billion people. Break it up into small little states. Don't try to have one large chunk. When you break it up into small little chunks, it becomes easy to digest. And you start from Kerala and then move into India through the South Indian states. Was one of my thoughts in terms of how to look at India. So that's broadly the context behind my suggestion,
No,
really.
I get that, but let me approach that conversely. Given the size
Yes,
of India and the size of Sri Lanka, why would India
yes.
be worried about opening up its market to Sri Lanka? I mean, what possibly could Sri Lanka do to sort of upset Indian markets?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I would say the same thing to you, Mr. Sen, which is that actually speaking, Indian market is so huge. One of the theories I've always had, when I look at the Sri Lankan American trade relations, with
Hmm.
70%, of all of the exports from Sri Lanka going to the West, which is US and UK, and very
Right.
little actually going to India. And if you really look at what's coming from the West into Sri Lanka, it's very, very little. They import very little
Hmm.
into Sri Lanka, but a lot of the exports go into America. That's because many of these markets don't get impacted by the scale and size of what Sri Lanka can deliver into those markets. It doesn't really affect any of the American categories of markets, or any of the, for example, garments. Sri Lankan products coming into America does not really have an impact per se on America. And my premise is, if the same has to happen with India, I can't see how the Indian markets can get impacted by a flow of Sri Lankan products. So if you ask me, India needs to open its hearts out, and if it was up to me, I would have said there needs to be a zero tariff regime where Sri Lankan products, the best cinnamon, the best garments, the best tea, should actually free flow into Indian markets, and there'll hardly be an impact on in the medium to long term in the Indian markets, because many of these products would be premium products, better quality products for the Indian market, and I know Indians are really hungry for high quality products. I mean, I was in Kerala recently for the Invest in Kerala summit, and I
Hmm.
came back feeling so energized, feeling that this is where we need to start. Where I met the chairman of the Kochi Chamber of Commerce, and he mentioned something very interesting to me. He said, "We are a meat eating state, and we have a need for processed food." And he said, when we look at processed food, it comes from many of our neighboring states, and it's not really high quality. And he had visited Sri Lanka and had some of the really high quality processed meat that's available in Sri Lanka. And I said, you know what, if you bring the processed free meat from Sri Lanka to India, we'll all pay a premium for it. And I thought that was a great insight in terms of how Sri Lanka can enter India. High quality products, premium products, and we should have a zero tariff regime, if you ask me.
No, we definitely should. We definitely should. I personally am impacted because I love Nuvra Elia tea, and for love of money, I can't get
Yes,
it here. I have to ask my
exactly,
friends that please
exactly,
get me whenever you come here. Please get me some Nuvra Elia tea. So,
exactly, exactly.
excuse me. So, but let's come back to this visit. If you had some kind of a thing other than the zero tariff regime, what else would you say
Yes,
India needs to do to sort of promote Sri Lankan investment in India? I think Sri Lanka already invests in some areas in India already, pretty large sums in that sense.
yes,
But they're not
yes,
in. I mean, they're not into sort of export. But I think in some ports and other areas they're involved in some way. But other
yes.
than spices and tea, what are the other items that Sri Lanka could possibly want to export to India?
Yeah, I mean, see, I think there
Meat,
are
you mentioned. Yeah.
many. Uh, Sorry, yeah, not in terms of scale and size, but in terms of intent. We
Hmm.
ever since we launched Lanka India Business Association, we've had several kinds of inquiries for membership, and I think that gives me an indication of the kind of the kind of companies and the kind of business people who are interested in looking at the Indian market, and therefore I would look
Right.
at that data as indicative of what are the kind of things that can come into India. We've had retail outlets like shops which sell fantastic prawn food, and they've actually kind of, in a sense, patented their recipes and their food and their propositions, wanting to come
No,
into
you make me
uh, come
full
into
already
India. Sorry,
because I
exactly.
remember
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
seafood in Sri Lanka. Yeah,
Yes,
but
exactly.
yeah.
So
So
seafood. So
and
that's one.
uh, so the other thing that I
Yes,
wanted
Mr.
to
Sen.
talk about in the article that you wrote for us, you mentioned that we
Yes,
need. Well, I think it was a bit one-sided in the sense that you mentioned that Sri Lanka needs to get over its sort of baggage, as you mentioned. You know,
Yes.
what would be the main sort of, how would I say, friction point or baggage that you think needs to be sort of overcome? Is it? I mean,
Yeah.
let's not get too much of politics, but otherwise as well. Is there still a lot of resentment about the IPKF thing, or is there still a lot of resentment about, I don't know, what else is there resentment about?
Yeah, I think, actually speaking, on the ground, the only sticking point between India and Sri Lanka right now is the fishermen's issue. The fact that
Okay.
fishermen from Tamil Nadu still come into the northern waters and poach, causing a fair
Hmm.
amount of concern in northern Sri Lanka. And, rightly so, a lot of northern fishermen seem to feel that it's impinging on their livelihoods. And the methods used, like bottom trawling, which are unsustainable, is a matter of concern in Sri Lanka, especially in the north, and I think gets raised regularly amongst amongst the powers that be within Sri Lanka. But other than that, I don't think there are any particular sticking points in the relationship. However, there is a
Hmm.
context of memory. And I
Right.
think if you talk to anybody who's 40-year-old and above, they do have a lingering sense of resentment that, during the, 23-year war that happened in Sri
Right.
Lanka, India was seen as a, as a primary driver of that war to some extent, and that
Hmm.
there is a blame that is assigned to India for pulling Sri Lanka back so many years in its economic development by being involved in that war. So I think there is that lingering thing, and there is a suspicion also that being such a large country, would Sri Lanka be overwhelmed and swallowed up by the size of India, and would
Right.
that ambition exist? Um, However, when I talk to youngsters, that resentment in that sense doesn't exist that much. I
Hmm.
think young people nowadays who have access to social media and see all of the new things that are happening in India want to be somehow part of that journey, and therefore I think it's important we keep talking to younger people, encouraging startups to come to Sri Lanka and to India and start benefiting from the Indian market. And I think that effort is on in a big way. Many friends of mine in the Indian High Commission work very hard to make sure that these connections are made and to make sure that opportunities are given to all of those young people. And I genuinely see smart young people who Sri Lankans who are on Twitter engaging in very open, honest conversation about how we should integrate. Integrate. When I use the word integrate, I have to be careful because I would say how to exploit is a better way of expressing it rather than to use integrate, because integrate comes with uh,
Again, package of its own, that word
with
has.
those fears of
Yeah.
co-opting the country. Whereas I think the intent is more to exploit and take advantage of. Milan, one of your other speakers uses that word extremely well. Exploiting India and taking advantage of India and making use of India's growth is what is a kind of conversation we really should be having.
Hmm. Um,
So,
as the
so
president,
yes,
sorry,
resentment is there. Resentment is there, and I think one way to deal with is to talk to younger people. But I also have to, sorry, Mr. Sen, I have to add one thing. I think
sure.
India's effort after the economic crisis in being a first responder, and the speed and the scale at with which we did it, I think has been well appreciated in all quarters. I think everyone, irrespective of demographic and irrespective of political persuasion, accepts the fact that India has actually played a crucial role in bringing Sri Lanka back on its feet during that very period of great crisis. I mean, I was here throughout the entire period, so I know what the country went through, and I know all of us what we went through during that time.
Hmm. But again, I always sort of applauded Sri Lanka for the fact that despite all the troubles that it has gone through, it has stuck to the democratic tradition. Not once has the army come in and tried to do something, or I think it has held elections
It's,
on time, and they've always been free and fair. It's a wonderful political system for them to work on, because anywhere else in the world you would have had the military coming in and saying, we'll run the place. Look at all our neighbors. I mean, that's how they operate. But it's really impressive.
I'll tell you. Yeah, it is very impressive. This country is very, very, very amazing. I mean, I have to tell you. So, I mean, I told you my heart is in Sri Lanka. So, I have to tell you this
Yeah.
little bit of a story. You know, when this economic crisis was going on and there were strikes happening and Araglaya was going on, there were many Indian media people who were here, and we took them out for lunch one day because they've been working very hard covering all of the stories. So I asked a couple of them, so what's your take on what's happening? And they said, we are stunned at how the protests happened. People stand in, in a very, with a lot of decorum on the sides of the road. They've got these placards with them, and they stand and they allow traffic to go through. They don't create chaos. Even their shouting is not loud as it can be. And the amazing part for the Indian media was when they finish the protest, they take away all their placards put it into their bags and carry it back with them. What kind of protests are these? you know. So I mean, this is Sri Lanka for you, I think. And like you said, the last elections that were held here, there was zero violence recorded. This is
We need
quite
to
an
learn a lot of
incredible
things from the Sri Lankan system. I think definitely we need to
100%.
learn, particularly
100%.
the way we protest.
Yes,
But
yes. I think there's a lot to learn from Sri Lanka, and I think for a small island, it has some amazing examples to offer. Whether it be the quality of the roads, and there's a lot of learning for India from Sri Lanka as well. I think while I think of course Sri Lanka needs to take benefit from the economic dividend and exploit India for that. But I think there's a lot of people. Every Indian who comes here, I always tell them that we've got a lot to learn from Sri Lanka as well.
Mhm. But personally, suppose you might be meeting the prime minister when he comes in. What would be one major ask that you would have from him? What do you think he should come and offer to Sri Lanka? One major, not might not necessarily be business, but something that he should do or not do.
Yeah, I think I think I would think business if primarily Mr. Sen, because primarily if you ask me right now, the need of the hour is for Sri Lankans to feel secure about living in this country. Many people are
Hmm.
leaving the country and going. Young people are leaving the country and going. Many of my own
Yes.
colleagues who have children worry about the future of their children in terms of, well, what will this economy be like? Will we go back into crisis in 2028 when repayment has to be done? So I would actually say, if he really has a big heart and he really wants to help the country, he must come here and say, I mean, what I suggested, which is bring your products in. We have a big market. We will let you do what you want to do in this country. Get your products. We don't have a tariff system for you. Sri Lanka can come and do what they want in India, at least for the next, maybe it needs to be a time bound thing, maybe for the next 5 years or 10 years, while the country recovers and stabilizes fully economically. I think that would kind of make a statement of largesse, which would change and reverse the sentiment even lingering, if there are any, amongst the population of Sri Lanka. Because ultimately, the Sri Lankan families will uh, realize that their livelihoods are coming from Indian markets, and that whatever they produce is going to go into Indian markets, and that's how they're going to rebuild their economy. Then I think there is no other way for Sri Lankans but to understand that India genuinely means what it says, in terms of having the best interests of the island in their hearts, and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. So, for me, that is a key thing, and business is the key criteria. Economy is a key thing that needs to be worked on in Sri Lanka. There are many, many other beautiful things about this island. It's got pristine waters, and it's blessed by nature, and it's got beautiful people, and great food and all of that. What it currently needs is a sense of security
Hmm.
that its economy will not be plunged back into the kind of situation it was plunged back into 2022, and that families with children must feel secure that they have a great future in this island. So that to me is a key thing as far as Sri Lanka is concerned.
That's interesting because what you just mentioned, that a lot of people come to Sri Lanka. Tourists, Indian tourists are the largest. Number of Indian tourists I think is in go to Sri Lanka.
Yes.
But yet
Yes.
they come back saying that we are surprised by this, we are surprised by that. Over the years,
Yes.
Us being such close neighbors and everything, why is there this element of surprise? Is there, I mean, do we have a similar kind of a flow of Sri Lankan tourists to India? I mean, what I'm
Yeah.
asking basically
No.
is that is there a disconnect between the people?
Yeah, no, I think there's been a lot of media. See, Indian media also likes to kind of play up some of the things related to. I know you're part of the media, but I just don't mean to, blame
Mhm.
anyone in particular. But I think, during the economic crisis, the number of shots of that president's palace being broken down was shown so many times that even today when people need to come to Sri Lanka, some of my friends call me and say, is it safe? I said, listen, buddy, it was never unsafe. Even during Araglia, I lived here. Other than that area and presidential complex where that storming happened, where no lives were lost and no injuries were reported, but it got shown as if some major disaster happened and that country went into anarchy. This country never went into
Right.
anarchy. Let's be very clear. And therefore, I think some of those images needs to change. And I think even today, Indians, if recently some YouTuber went around India and asked, what do you think of Sri Lanka? And everyone said economic crisis first.
Right.
you know
That's a
so
big
there is
thing.
that surprise when they come here and see that, oh, not only is there no economic crisis, it's an amazingly pristine, beautiful country with lovely people, great food, and wonderful roads, and and people live a good life in Sri Lanka.
Hmm. That's true. That's true. I mean, couple of times that I've been there, I was really impressed by the hospitality, if nothing else, shown to me by the people there. I mean,
Yes.
but
Yes. Yes.
we're almost at the end of the discussion. You mentioned what you would ask Prime Minister Modi if you were to meet him, that do they put zero tariff for Sri Lankan products. What would you
Yes.
ask the Sri Lankan president to do? You mentioned that will he
I
hug?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I was actually saying that, right? I mean, that was my original headline, but I think, to your credit, Mr. Sen, you did a great job editing my article and making it very crisp in 1,000 words. So I must give credit back to you where it is due on the article that I wrote. But I think, I felt that, that hug is important. When I say hug, I don't mean just for the cameras. I mean, it's time for Sri Lankans to um, uh, wholeheartedly embrace India's intentions and understand that we are a civilizational twin. And I must give credit to Mr. Gopal Bagle, the ex High Commissioner of India, who coined the
Mhm.
term civilizational twin. I think very often in the India Sri Lanka relationship, Sri Lankans are known to refer to India as a big brother. And I remember Mr. Bagle saying, no, I think it's a relationship of equality, and I think that's how it should always be.
Absolutely.
But we are a civilizational twin, and to that extent, when one civilizational twin gets into trouble, the other twin responds, and that's what happened in the way India responded in 2023. My feeling is Sri Lankans need to understand that there is a baggage of resentment, and that the time has genuinely come to get rid of that baggage, and the time has come to
Mhm.
go beyond that baggage and to really embrace India, and to understand that India is always going to stand by Sri Lanka in times of crisis, and is going to always be there for Sri Lanka at its times of need. And not only that, that actually speaking, just as much as many people in Sri Lanka have a resentment towards India for what it did, most Indians really don't really have any kind of negative feeling towards Sri Lanka. I don't think even at the worst of times when Jayasuriya was slaughtering our bowlers around the park, we ever felt bad about Sri Lanka. In fact, we all hugged Jayasuriya for the incredible batting that he did. If I might get into cricket for a
Absolutely.
little bit, because that's another common passion between the two countries, right?
Yes.
I think
Yes.
Jai Surya would come to Mumbai and get mobbed everywhere he went, right? I mean, and that's true for any Sri Lankan cricketer today as well. So I think that's the important thing. I think it's time for AKD to not just hold Mr. Modi's hand. He needs to open his arms and embrace and say, you know, it's time for Sri
Let's grow
Lanka to
together.
embrace India.
Mhm. On that very, very positive note, I'm afraid I must bring this interview to an end. I look forward to speaking to you again sometime soon after this, perhaps, soon after this visit, to see if some of the things you hope for have been started off. You know, and may I also request you to keep writing
Yes,
for us every now and then, because, I think it's important that we get that
most
viewpoint across.
certainly,
You know, thank
most
you
certainly.
so
Happy
very
to, Mr.
much.
Sen, and
And,
thank you so much.
and I look forward to having you with us again.
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. Thank you for having me on your show.
You know, that was Mr. Santosh Menon, president of the Sri Lanka India Business Association, in a very candid conversation about what he would want from Prime Minister Modi's visit to Sri Lanka, not just from the Indian side, but also from the Sri Lankan side. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to having you with us again. Till then, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.